Hello, I'm Jackie Miller, introducing today's dialogue on behalf of Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science, joining you today from Lekwungen Territory in Victoria, BC. We began this online dialogue series in July of 2020, when the in-person forum that we had been planning had been postponed due to public health reasons. Over the course of this time, we've brought together an exceptional group of panelists on a variety of subjects, including ethical space, two-eyed seeing, braiding ways of knowing, spiritual relationships to the land, co-management and land use planning, stewarding our relations to forests and watersheds and to marine ecosystems, and decolonizing science education. The theme of our dialogue today is the important role Indigenous languages play in carrying Indigenous knowledge, develop in relationship with place, reflected in the diverse range of languages and relationships with land around the world. Before we turn to today's dialogue, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. Our dialogue will last for approximately 2 hours. And after formally opening the session and hearing from our panel as well as our conveners, the moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, will turn to you, our attendees, for about 15 minutes of Q&A. The chat function will be closed during the dialogue, so we ask that you please direct your questions for the speakers through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can post your questions there at any time during the panel discussion. We'll also not be using the raise hands function, so please direct your questions for the speakers through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're recording the session, so anyone unable to participate in the entire session can view it online later, but we're grateful if you can stay with us for the entirety of the discussion. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's dialogue, Dr. Nancy Turner. Dr. Nancy Turner is an emeritus professor in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria and is an ethnobotanist whose research interests integrate the fields of botany and ecology with anthropology, geography, linguistics, amongst others. She's worked with Indigenous elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern Turtle Island for over 40 years, collaborating with Indigenous peoples to help document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and habitats, including language and vocabulary relating to their plants and environments. This is just a bit about Nancy, whose full bio is online. Over to you now, Nancy.
Hawa Jackie, I squire, I quanase, hlum ama, I chuutsqa. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a great honor to first introduce our respected Haida elder, Dr. Tla-o-qui-aht Betty Richardson, to open our session in a good way. And Betty, I'll turn it over to you.
Howard dalang wadlohan at stings at the Gudungait law stuga. If you'll all quiet yourselves in prayer. Satlana gunang itil khaidagas. Danki gai skana waga. Hayat ginat dalang kilgothgas at sting salana. Ginat la guila it dangandal. Gakayast is gu isis githa tulgat. Tulgai kait guhan gugast is a sing. Lasa ging da guero. It kunisi killing it gid that aslugan at utalang wadiga. Hawa it kunisi. It kanflat lailda. Taalgyaa'adad gugalang khas laging gagu salana. Gakwan gudungai kuhida kotslga. Gajachidas at ugitkalang kuyas. Giflat lai ista. Gaithan chidas asing. Dau ginawadluchan gan kulaga salana. Dau ginawadluchan gan unsida. Hawa. Amen.
Betty, that was beautiful. And it's so nice to hear those beautiful sounds of the Haida language that I've had the privilege of hearing for many, many years, although I don't speak the language myself. But that was really beautiful to hear. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our panelists, including Dr. Taalgyaa'adad. And I will just say a few words and let them mostly introduce themselves. But as Jackie has noted, this is one of the very last of our sessions from Reconciling Ways of Knowing. And it's very fitting, I think, that we are bringing in people who are specializing in the importance of language. Language diversity is part of what Wade Davis has called the ethnosphere. And the ethnosphere is comparable and intertwined with the biosphere and equally important in terms of the sustainability of our planet. So there's much wisdom and knowledge that's embodied and embraced in our language. And having a diversity of languages means that there is more knowledge and wisdom that we all need today in this time of all kinds of problems in the world, environmental and social problems. We need all of the wisdom, all of the knowledge, all of the decision-making and forethought that we can possibly have. So today, I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists, as I said, and we'll let them introduce themselves more fully. But we'll start with Dr. Wade Davis, who is an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. He's also a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia, an ethnobotanist, an ethnographer, a writer, photographer, filmmaker, and a good friend for many, many years of mine. So it's really nice to have you here, Wade. Our next speaker will be Gisèle Martin. She's from the House of Layla, and excuse me, Gisèle, for if I don't say that properly, but you can correct me. Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and is a cultural lifeways and Indigenous language specialist, a guardian, a public speaker, educator, outdoor guide, new channel canoe captain, artist and photographer. And I've known her and her family also for many years, and it's really nice to have you with us, Gisèle. Chuutsqa Layla Rorick, from the Hesquiaht First Nation, a founding member of the grassroots Hesquiaht Language Program, along with all the remaining fluent speakers of this Nuu-chah-nulth language, and a graduate of the Masters in Indigenous Language Revitalization Program at the University of Victoria. And she's joining us from Snuneymuxw, the territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, where I am as well today on Protection Island, and chuutsqa is over on the Nanaimo side. And you've already heard from Dr. Taalgyaa'adad Betty Richardson. She's a Haida mother and grandmother who is a member of the Eagle of the Tsach clan. She's one of 9 Haida elders who for over 2 decades have tirelessly recorded and revitalized the Xaayda dialect of Xaayda Kil through the Xaayda Haida Immersion Program. And oh, I wish you could see the dictionary that they produced. It's huge. It weighs a ton and it's full of wonderful words from Xaayda Haida. She and other language experts were recently awarded honorary doctoral degrees from Vancouver Island University in recognition of their work to strengthen the Haida language. So welcome to all of our panelists. And we hope you feel free to introduce yourselves further as we go. I'll start with Wade. And perhaps, Wade, you could elaborate on the term ethnosphere and its relationship to both ethnodiversity and biodiversity. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. We'll have each panelist speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have another round of comments or discussion after that. So Wade, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Nancy. And it's a wonderful pleasure to be with all of you, good friends, new friends, revered elders. You know, the term ethnosphere I coined back in the 1990s as a kind of an organizing principle, obviously in balance to the term biosphere, to a term that would capture the social web of life around the planet. And I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and inspirations, myths and memories brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. I describe the ethnosphere as humanity's great legacy, the culmination of all that we'd achieved and the promise of all that we could achieve as a wildly creative species. And of course, a fundamental point of this was to reflect on the fact that just as the biosphere is being threatened, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything, at a far greater rate. Even E.O. Wilson at the time would never suggest that 50% of all plant and animal species, for example, were on the brink of extinction, yet that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approached what we knew to be from linguistics. The most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity, and the great indicator of that at the time was language loss. And of the 7,000 languages spoken in the day that I was born, by the 1990s, fully half weren't being taught to children in cultures around the world. Now, I made the point that a language isn't just vocabulary or grammar. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every particular culture comes in the material world. Every language, I said in a bit of writing, was an old growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual and cultural possibilities. And I found language a very powerful way to engage an audience. You know, if you said to a hall of people, imagine what it'd be like to be the last speaker of your native tongue, to have no ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. How would that feel? And of course, there are many critics who said, well, wait a minute, wouldn't we all get along better if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication around the world be facilitated? And my retort to that was always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that universal language Inuktitut. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Quechua. Let's make it Tibetan. You suddenly begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no ability to pass on the wisdom. And yet, statistically, that fate is the plight of somebody somewhere on earth every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. My point, of course, at the time was this does not have to happen. But now we're even more acutely aware of how significant that is, ironically, perhaps because of the revelations of genetics. In the last generation, indeed, almost since I took up that cause, if you will, geneticists have finally proven something to be true that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is that we really are brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're indeed all descendants of the first human, including those who walked out of Africa some 65,000 years ago. And in this incredible journey of 40,000 years, just 2,500 human generations carried the human spirit to every corner of the world. But here's the vital point. If we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, by definition, the people of every culture share the same genius, the same mental acuity, the same raw human brilliance. And critically, Whether that genius is placed into, for example, technological wizardry, the great achievement of the West, or conversely, as would be the case in the amongst the Aboriginal civilization of Australia, placed into the complex task of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the realm of culture. That old Victorian idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London, that somehow Victorian Western society sat at the apex of the pyramid that went down to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely ridiculed by modern science, dismissed as an artifact of the 19th century, as distant from our lives and as false to our lives and as irrelevant to our lives as a notion that clergymen had in that distant century, that the earth was but 6,000 years old. In this stunning affirmation of the intuitions of the first great activist anthropologists, geneticists has proven the truth of the notion of cultural relativism. So what does this really mean? It means fundamentally that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts to be you. They're not failed attempts to be modern. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices, the 7,000 languages of humanity. And those answers and those intuitions become our collective repertoire for dealing with all of the challenges that will confront us in the coming centuries. Fundamental lesson is this: every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard. Each one deserves a place at the Council of Human Wisdom, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. I'll give you one final quick example of that. When the British washed ashore on the shores of Australia, they saw a people that looked strange, who had a simple material technology. But what really offended the British is the Aboriginal civilization had no interest in material progress, in improving upon their lot. And because that ethos was the essence of British thought in the 19th, 18th century, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aborigines weren't human at all, and they began to shoot them. As recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginals were human or not. In the 1950s, people had quotas as to how many abos could be shot with impunity on the ranches. In the 1960s, a book used in school across the country, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, included the Aboriginal people as examples of the wildlife of the continent. What was missing, of course, was the inability of the British to understand the most subtle and beautiful devotional philosophy perhaps ever brought into being by the human imagination. That was dreaming. And the whole ethos in Australia was the antithesis of progress. It was stasis. The purpose of life wasn't to change anything. It was to keep it just as it was the time of its creation, when the rainbow serpent lay upon the land and the ancestors sang the world into being. The important point isn't to say who's right and who's wrong. If humanity had followed that trajectory, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon. On the other hand, we wouldn't be talking today about climate change. Every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard. Each deserves a place at the Council of Human Wisdom, and each language distills a lineage that goes back by definition to the dawn of time. The value of a language is not the size of the audience. It's the poetry and prayers expressed in the language and the words and the syntax and the beauty of that language.
Wade, thank you. I'd say that as languages go, you have a better command of the English language than almost anyone I've ever heard speak English. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Gisèle, maybe you could take up the thread here of Wade's conversation. You'll need to unmute yourself and maybe talk about, from your own perspective and your work with the Nuu-chah-nulth language, and maybe talk about some of the incredible work that you've done and the meaning of words like chuutsqa for tree that I think carries a lot of knowledge and wisdom with it.
Tla-o-qui-aht Chani, Tla-o-qui-aht 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 Gisèle Martin, hosat. Na'ata is a word that we often hear at the beginning of speeches in our communities. It means listen up, na'ata chani, listen up for a moment. But that doesn't just mean listen with our ears, with our puppy. It's listen with our whole being, listen with our heart, listen with our guts, listen with our intuition. And there's no hierarchy of logic over intuition in our language. A lot of things have really come clear to me learning to speak our language. I grew up speaking French and English. My language was completely mixed up until I was 5. Nobody could understand me unless they spoke both languages. And I've always been really interested in our culture. You know, I spent a lot of time outside. I grew up without TV. I wanted to learn everything I could learn: plants, animals, stories. But there's a lot of gray areas. And it wasn't until beginning to learn our language that I feel like learning our language is like learning to see the world in full color, whereas French and English was very black and white. So there's perceptions and things that it can't even translate yet. You know, it's really hard. Before I started learning language, I used to go and visit late Elder Mary Hayes of Tla-o-qui-aht, and I'd go and visit her and I'd ask her all kinds of things. I'd bring her plants and ask about them, and she'd tell me amazing things. Sometimes I'd ask her questions and she didn't know the answer, you know, and she was like, oh, I can't remember. I know that this information was here, but I don't have access to it, or we don't know of it. And as I learned, you know, as I heard those answers, and in tandem with the effects of the Indian residential schools, learning about that when I was a teenager, I got really angry and I got really sad at the destruction of the life force of our land, of the forests, of the abuse of animals around us, of the bears and the birds, the insects. And I remember going to visit her one day and I was really bummed out. I was really mad, and I was just like feeling like, like everything's lost, like we're losing everything. We can't find somebody who knows the names of the constellations in our languages. We know that we had names for the big open ocean currents way out in the Pacific. I can't find those names. I can't find these specific songs for coming of age for young women. And she said to me then, she said, like, don't worry. Our knowledge is in the land. As long as we protect the plants, as long as we protect the animals, the spirit of the places, we can relearn directly from them because it's alive in the land. So I guess that kind of catapulted me into working to protect our land. And it wasn't until some decades went by that I really started to learn our language finally. Thank you, chuutsqa. And I began learning names of plants and animals, and I label everything in my kitchen. One thing that there's epiphanies that come from language every day, and I'm going to continue learning. And one that I've really enjoyed lately is ish. We have no gendered pronouns in our language. In English, there's he, she, it. There's a lot of talk about he and she in our language. He, she, it is ish. And that is they. It is a singular they. So there's not only no hierarchy of he over she, or he, she over it. Like most animals in English are relegated to being it. They are objectified. You know, they're not part of our family in English. But in our own language, they are a tree. They are a bear. The bear went for a walk and they went to the island. The insect, they are thirsty, you know. Even the rock, it extends to the rock and the air and the water. They are alive. And my uncle, or my grandpa, Levi, one of my mentors, you know, he's often said to me, like, this land is made of the dust of our ancestors. And to think about that, it's not just the dust of our human ancestors, it's the ancestors of all life, that family that we are from. So our language is not just a human language, Tla-o-qui-aht, it is a language of the land. And a lot of the sounds are the onomatopoeia from the plants and the animals directly. We learn to speak, we learn how to be in life, not just how to say things, but how to be from the plants and the animals and the elements. So chims is bear. Some people say chums. And that also comes from the word chi-chi-chi, which is the first word that I learned as a child, I think, or teachma, heart. But chi-chi-chi is a really easy one, chi-chi-chi. It's our teeth, but everything is named for the verb that it does. So chi-chi-chi is almost like cut, 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 or chop, chop, chop. And bears communicate with one another and with us with their teeth also. You know, they need a lot of space. There are words in our language connected to the word chims, like chims chi us means to be happy, to be comfortable. But literally, when you break it down, chims chi us, it sounds like to be like a bear on the land. Chuutsqa is to be happy. It sounds like being really bear-like. But what does a bear need to be happy and to be comfortable? They need space. They need their boundaries respected, you know, and people are always getting up in their faces these days, not respecting their boundaries. And the bears are just trying to navigate the land. They have an ancient treaty with us as human beings to respect one another's space. And as long as we respect that, we can all live happily and comfortably. But the way that they communicate with each other is they knock their teeth together, and it's that sound chi chi chi, and we can use that same to communicate with them. You know, when I'm out hiking or camping, if there's a bear, just take a couple rocks and knock them together gently. We don't need to swear. We don't need to use giant bear bangers most of the time. We don't need to be rude. Just the old language is a really good way to go. So chims, chi-chi-chi, you know, you can hear the sound of the teeth knocking, but it also means to cut, but to cut is the edge of our boundaries also. So really the word for chims doesn't just mean bear, it is a word that is exemplified by the bear's life and what the bear does. Another one is ka. If I say ka, like ka tsi islet maksti, like give me power of the universe. What does a crow say? Ka, ka, ka. And they are called ka'in in our language. And it's literally like where we say ka, like pass me the salt, ka tsi is sant. So give to me, give to me. Quini is a seagull, and you know, you often see a baby seagull on the beach going quini, 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 and they want something that's not theirs, but they want it, and that's turned into a verb in our language as well. Like we say, quinash, like you really want that thing that's not yours, like you're really eyeing up that last cookie or whatever. Quinash. And that's not to make fun of the seagull, even though it is funny. You know, there's a really, really old history. We have stories of all the animals doing many different things and all the different life forms. And seagull actually helped save the day a long time ago during the time of climate change. About 10,000 years ago, there was a massive storm, and the only one that actually ended up helping us and stopping the storm was Quini, and they were so vigilant and wanting to try this thing that everybody just finally let them, and they saved the day. And it's a long story, I won't tell it here. So there's also Tzihwatin, which is eagle. Tzihwatin. What does an eagle say before the break of dawn outside of my house? They're usually the ones that wake me up, and I hear tsa, 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 you know, before they do the and that tsih, tsih is in their name. Tzihwatin. Wa is to say. Tzihwatin. So it's almost like they bring us words. Tzihwatin. And that is connected to the word tsikyakuk. Tsikyaq is our language, the way that we speak, the way that we say things as we're walking. Tsitzikink are prayers. And there's a place called Tsihuatsats in Tla-o-qui-aht territory, in Tla-o-qui-aht tribal parks. chuutsqa, you could translate it as meaning like the throne of the eagle or the place of the eagle's nest. When you go to that site though, you can see why it's called that. And it's not just because there's an eagle's nest, because there's many places with eagle nests and they're not all called chuutsqa. But when you walk out on the sandspit and you get to the island, you look behind you and you get this huge panorama of all the beaches and the mountains, and your perspective totally expands, just like an eagle's would when they fly high up. And that's one thing that language brings to us. It expands our perspective. So language is not just about me talking or you talking. It's about us listening. And again, na'atah, to listen with our whole being, to the land, to the animals, the plants. Learning language has changed my perspective on so many things, and I have new perspectives, like new channel perspectives on English now, new N-U-U, not N-E-W, and some of them that, you know, I've really been kind of affronted by lately has been like the word wilderness. People talk about Tla-o-qui-aht territory, wilderness. There's no word for wilderness in our language. Wathiu, it means home. That's the closest translation. Sustainability, that's another word we did not practice in Tla-o-qui-aht. We practiced abundability, and I know that's not in the English dictionary yet, but it should be. We cannot afford to just practice sustainability at this time. We need to work way harder than that, like our ancestors did. I've worked with, I was asked to work with land use planning some years ago, and because of those new channel insights, I was like, no, we cannot do land use planning. We need to do land care planning. And another one is sorry. You know, people often ask, oh, well, how do you say this? How do you say thank you? How do you say hello? There's no word for sorry in our language. So what does that mean with truth and reconciliation? I don't know, but the only appropriate response that would be close to the idea of sorry in Tla-o-qui-aht is to immediately change your behaviors and actions. So yeah, learning language has changed a lot of things for me. And Nancy asked me to talk about chuutsqa. Tree is chuutsqa. Chuutsqa is the word for tree, but it doesn't just mean tree. All the names of everybody in our language reflect the verbs that they do. So suchi is like hold this. Suchit is to hold. Chuutsqa literally means to hold the land, and that's the word for tree. So you can imagine if the logging corporations, replace the word tree in all of their plans, or forestry corporations, and say, okay, we're just going to cut all these landholders off of the mountain, and hopefully there won't be any landslides. It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, language just has so much in it. Chuutsqa is deer fern. I don't know what the name means yet. Chuutsqa. I'm gonna have to think about that. Put-ih-mupt is rose. Put sounds like something that pierces, maybe. Chitupt is a cutting. It's a sedge that has a really sharp edge, so you can hear that chi in it. That cutting. Chitupt. Tla-o-qui-aht, it is thimbleberry, Tla-o-qui-aht. And that is like when we have a potlatch ceremony and people are singing a ceremonial song. They usually sing it 4 times, and we'll hear somebody, I heard this as a child, somebody yelling just before the last round, they say, Tla-o-qui-aht! And it's like, I thought that meant end the song for so long, but learning our language, I learned, no, it's literally like, release it back to the universe. So the song isn't going silent or going dead, it's released back into the universe, and that's where our languages are. They're still alive. So yeah.
Thank you, Gisèle. That was wonderful. I don't know how you managed to fit in so much knowledge and wisdom and information for us in such a short time, but thank you. And I learned a lot from you just in those brief minutes of talking about the bear and all of the other words that that you taught us. So thank you so much. And now I would love the chuutsqa to come in and join the conversation and maybe introduce yourself a little bit, talk about your work and your experiences as a language teacher and an activist, and your Hesquiaht roots, your relationships with your home place, and anything else that you want to share with us. We're very happy to have you.
Tla-o-qui-aht. I'm happy to see you all. chuutsqa. I am called chuutsqa. That's my Indian name. Hesquiaht. I'm a Hesquiaht woman. Hot Springs Cove. Hot Springs Cove. I grew up in Hot Springs Cove, one of our Hesquiaht reserves. I'm from the House of Kinquashtaqum. It's within the Hesquiaht tribe. My parents live in Aizaq. Stephen, Karen, Charleston, Uxlai. Always a real pleasure to hear Gisèle. She's a really engaging storyteller, or they are a very good, very engaging storyteller. Sorry, Gisèle. They are just so engaging. So those who speak more than one language will attest, no doubt, to all of the different emotions that come into your consciousness when you launch into speaking languages that are subsequent to your mother tongue. With Nuuchqaq language, it's just like that. It's when you're speaking our language, like many other Indigenous languages of the world, our language, Nuuchqaq, it comes from our land and our seascape. It was born here on this Chuutsqa, now known as Vancouver Island, on the west side. And me and Gisèle from this panel are some of about 10,000, roughly 10,000 people who were born into the Nuuchqaq birthright that comes with, carrying this language that was birthed on this land and connects us to the West Coast and connects us to all of those feelings and understandings that our ancestors meant for us to go through in our lives. So when it comes to our feelings about speaking our language, I first want to point out that our feelings are housed in a Nuuchqaq way. Our feelings are housed in the inside of our bodies, in this area here, your upper torso. It's called Tlii-maqsti here. And not only are your feelings going around in your Tlii-maqsti, but your mind and your thinking is also happening within your Tlii-maqsti. And your Tlii-maqsti is connected to your language that comes out. Everything that you speak should come from your Tlii-maqsti. Your Tlii-maqsti connects up and down as well. From this area where your Tlii-maqsti is, it connects you to everything in the world. So even though I was raised in our Hesquiaht homelands by colonial design, I didn't have an opportunity like Gisèle, where the same generation, we didn't become proficient speakers of our language because there was nowhere to hear our language spoken in communication around us. There was no kind of secondary happenstance of, oh, I can go and sit here and listen to my language, right? And so I can say for myself, I didn't actually grow up knowing about our Nuuchqaq manner of thinking and where our feelings and our mind is housed within our bodies. I didn't. I did connect, being raised in a community that our thoughts and our feelings are connected. But also learning the language also gave me an insight into how your feelings and your thoughts can connect you to all of creation. And so taking a moment to sort of feel where your chuutsqa is in your body. Inside your body, you can ask yourself, oh, how am I feeling? How are my thoughts right now? Am I connected to every being here? Are my feelings right now connected to creation? And is my voice being used? Is it emerging with a sound that is Hesquiaht? Is this actually the voice that comes from our place here? Does that rhythm sound like our place and our ancestors? And that all comes from a really place-specific connection between this place and our chuutsqa and our communities. So now we have originated in these places. We have thrived for all of time. In our stories, we have been here for all of time. We've been here feeling and thinking and being connected to all of creation. Our chuutsqa is Eqhmud. Eqhmud is a really powerful word in our language that expresses that we are both ancient to this place and we are continuing to this place, and that those will always be connected. We're building together forever since the beginning of time in these places. And although we're all together, we do have our individual personalities, our own chuutsqa, but that chuutsqa is also connected to a sort of a collective mind and knowledge of everything that's in our world. And so, you know, if we had that in our upbringing, can you imagine what that would have done for our mental health? Like, imagine having a mental health that is connected to everything. Like, that's rock solid, right? And we are still trying to bring this back into our daily lives by continuing to speak our language in our everyday life. And it's happening. We are really speaking our language every day together, and we have hundreds of people. I mean, I have so many students. Sometimes it's like, wow, this is a great problem. We have way too many people who want to be together learning, and we have a lot of people who are emerging speakers, and it's not a new thing either. Like I said, we're Eqhmud, we're ancient and continuing, and this colonial dark era in our lives has been like relatively short in the large scope of things, but yet we still remember the names of all of those groups of people within our nations that kept our language and did put safeguards into place in order to pass it on to us. And we're just the latest string of the same people who continue to speak our languages. We're just having some more access to different resources so that we can learn in immersion. We can learn how to pass our language on in immersion, being that we didn't have a sort of tradition of language teaching and learning in our past because we didn't need it. We do have a very strong tradition of continuation of our ancient ways and ancient knowledge. So we continue to build on that last sort of century and a half of unbroken community activism. That means our language and culture is still thriving and strong, although not, hasn't been at the forefront during this colonial period. We will see that it's going to emerge full strength for the next generations, as it has been meant to be. It will be a continuing knowledge in this area. And some of us who have been displaced from home to, especially with Hesquiaht people, our current circumstances is that, colonialism is working. We are displaced to different communities for a variety of different reasons. We are still, having a lot of language speakers across the continent here who are daily speaking our prayers in our language. They're making new jokes in our language. They're telling us daily news in our language. We're connecting, and our sphere of social influence is, we are being able to keep that strong. And what's ahead is connecting directly our language with our land, and carrying that forward in a really good Hesquiaht way, in a good Nuchanus way. And I really look forward to seeing more of that, because it's a wonderful time to be a Nuchanus person, and I just really want to express gratitude for that, and thank you for inviting me to participate in such a lively conversation today. Chuutsqa. I'm my mood is very uplifted and feeling good to see you all on this screen today. Zoom even though we might get tired of Zoom sometimes. We're still making things better by connecting. Chu.
Shli Mokstu. You really fill my heart and make me feel really good. Thank you so much. That was just a wonderful contribution to this conversation, and we're just thrilled to have you as part of it. And now we'd like to go back to Dr. Betty Taalgyaa'adad Richardson to maybe add your perspective to this conversation, Betty, from your own perspective of as a Haida speaker and one who has worked so hard to keep this language vital and ongoing and promote it to future generations.
I'm so impressed by those two young girls ahead of me. They did wonderful work. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't sure, I wasn't absolutely certain what I was in for in this dialogue here. And I ended up thinking that I was going to talk about how I learned my language and talk about my grandmother, talk about my mother. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I will add other things as well as I go along. I learned Xaayda Kil from my paternal grandmother. Her name was Jot of Singanga, which means Lady of the Dawn. My family and I lived with her until I was 13 years old. Xaayda Kil was her first language. She used to chuckle and say, I speak 3 languages. I speak Chinook, Haida, and England. She spoke very broken English, but she tried. My grandfather had died before I was born, so I didn't know him. My mother went to residential school for 8 years, so she wasn't allowed to speak her language. So both her and my dad spoke fluent Xaayda Kil, but they didn't speak it much when we were children. My dad also went to Indian day school where he wasn't allowed to speak his language. And my husband spoke his language. He learned his language from his grandmother as well. My husband was a hereditary chief of the Haida Nation. He died in 1999. That's when I started going to ship. And I started going to ship in 2000 after my husband died. And I was so thrilled to discover SHIP, this program where all the elders of the village were attending. There were about 15 of us when I first started. And every one of us, we were all relearning from one another. Like I say, my grandmother spoke Haida and she taught me Haida, but my parents didn't speak Haida. So when we started our program when I started in 2000, I couldn't believe what was going on. It was such a thrilling experience to go into this school where Haida was being taught and to become part of it and to become one of the teachers. My heart just sang with joy. I was hired at the nursery school in Gisèle to teach the 3- and 4-year-olds after I went to ship for quite a few years. It was the joy of my life to be teaching these children. They were delightful. They were just like sponges. They were so anxious to learn. And then when COVID came along, the little children weren't being vaccinated. So I didn't feel safe being in the school. That's when I quit. I've been mentoring 2 students for 2 years now. I mentor my granddaughter who lives in Vancouver, and I also mentor Russ Jones. He's one of the hereditary chiefs of Gisèle. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be working with them. I'm gonna give you a quote from one of our books of the Haida Nation that I wrote. To me, Xaayda Kil means the continuation of our very being, what it means to be on this earth, to be able to pass something down to the younger people will be a sign that we were here and are here and will continue in this world as a nation. And this is from my heart. I am enjoying the work that I do right now so much. And God bless each and every one of you. Thank you.
Oh, that was beautiful, Betty. And I can only imagine how much your granddaughter is enjoying her time and working with and learning from you, her own ancestral language. And Russ Jones too, who has been part of our dialogues around fisheries. It's really nice that you're working with him as well. It really, it's so reassuring to hear each of you talk and to listen to the diversity of how language plays in so many ways into our feelings, into our knowledge, into our relationships with plants and animals and with other people. It's just everything it is to be human, it seems to me. And we have a few minutes left, just a very few. If we could ask each of you again another round to maybe comment on what you've been hearing from the other panel members, and or tell a quick story. And so Wade, we'll start back with you again.
Well, thanks. I just have to say I was so personally moved by Gisèle and Housekeeping and also Nancy, but the young women. I mean, I don't know, Nancy Turner. You know, we're getting to be pretty old here, and to me, it's just I'm nearly 70. I think you're even maybe younger than that, but
I'm not.
it's just so inspiring to hear the voices of these extraordinary young women. And, you know, you mentioned eloquence in the English language. Well, you know, the English language, part of it's just it's such a bastard language, right? It's a compilation of so many different tongues, and it has a certain inherent efficiency, I suppose, which may be one of the reasons, besides the colonial history, that it has spread so widely. I mean, I've published books in Spanish that end up 150 pages longer in the Spanish language, simply because the English language has that kind of curt, but it also misses so much. I mean, my ancestry is Irish. You know, the British stood by as 1 million of us died. They stole our children too and forced them to learn in a different religious ideology, a different language. And today I think it's about less than 0.5 of 1% of Irish people speak the native tongue. And yet in that native tongue, there were 34 words for field. Now, not just the description of a field, but the entire totality in multi-dimensions, both temporal and spatial and spiritual, of what a field represented. And that's the power of language. And Gisèle spoke to that so powerfully. And it reminds me that when I wrote a little introduction for a wonderful book that the Skiddicott Museum did, you know, I tried to make the point that, you know, English has a word for eagle, but the Haida speak eagle. You know, the Penan, we have a word for the hornbill, but the Penan have a dialogue with the hornbill, as they do with the gibbons and the sounds that pass over. And this brings us to one really important point, is that all cultures are myopic. And the European paradigm, successful as it has been, dominant as it has been, should not suggest that it's the norm. It's the exception, the anomaly. You know, it's based on a Descartesian idea that de-animated the world, such that this world is just a stage upon which the human drama alone unfolds. Science made a house cleaning of belief. And that's why we can rip apart a mountain, tear down a forest, because they don't live for us. They're just resources waiting to be extracted. Well, that extractive paradigm is really exceptional. You look around the world, not just here on the coast, but all the places I've been over a 50-year life of travel, the key relationship between human beings and the natural world is always based on reciprocity. It's always based on some iteration of a fundamental equation that the earth owes its bounty to humans, but humans in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. Now that gets played out in ritual, in culture, but more importantly in the ecological footprint of a people. If you're raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct your destiny, as would be the case, for example, in the southern Andes of Peru, you're gonna have a different relationship to it than a kid raised here in British Columbia to believe that a mountain exists to be torn apart. You know, I was raised to believe that these forests existed to be cut, whereas friends of mine from, you know, amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw will say that the forest was the boat of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits and that had to be embraced during the homicide. Well, of course, it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. It's how the metaphor plays out in the lifeways of a people. And I would argue that the most important thing we need to do is get rid of the extractive paradigm and embrace reciprocity once again. Most cultures of the world do not see people as a problem, but the solution, because it's only through the human imagination, consciousness, and soul that the spirit of the land can come alive. And that's what we've been hearing today from every speaker.
Oh, thanks, Wade. That really is such an important points that you make. And I'm thinking of the new word now in English, abundability. I think we need to all work to get that into the English language.
I was scribbling down notes like mad when Gisèle was speaking. I just love the way you speak, Gisèle. You know, and just let me say something honestly. That's the kind of storytelling that that's how people get it. The beauty of how you approach your language. You know, you should be on every stage in Canada and North America and the world, just sharing as you did. I mean, first thing I'm going to do when I go back up to Taalgyaa'adad country where we're surrounded by black and grizzly bears. I'm going to get a couple of rocks and see if it actually works.
Okay, well, Gisèle, would you like to pick up there again and make any other observations or comments that you want to add to your wonderful original presentation?
Thank you. And thanks for listening to a na'ata, to listen with your whole being. We don't have a word either for God, like capital G-O-D in Nuu-chah-nulth. Our closest word is Nas, and that translates as daylight or the day or reality or God, but it's reality. And really it's what we observe and what we listen and what we communicate with manifested. That's Nas. Yeah, I don't know. I think being connected to language is just really tluthmapt. Like when I started learning finally, one word I had learned, I had noticed that all the ends of the plant names ended with mupt, and I thought that meant plant. And I got really excited at one point. I was trying to figure out the structure of our language and where the rules were. And, you know, if I could hear somebody, I thought, oh, now when I hear a speaker at a potlatch going, mupt, I'll know they're talking about a plant. And then I learned this word pishmupt. And in the dictionary, or the half-made dictionary we had, it said a bad, misbehaving little child. That's pishmupt. And I was like, what the hell? Where's the rules to this language? Oh, that's not a plant. What the heck? I got really discouraged. So it was like 5 years later, I was doing language immersion with Levi, and we had finally gotten to a point where we could have conversation. We'd spend 6 hours a day in immersion. And one day I was driving to town, we got really quiet, and he said, Tluth mupt itzk. I said, okay, tluth, good, nice, pretty, mupt, plant, itzk, you are. Is he telling me I'm a good plant? And I asked him at the end of the day, oh, what was that word tluthmapt? You know, when we could finally talk in English. Oh, tluthmapt means you are well rooted to the Hahuthi. You've been educated by your family. It is not just your human family, it's the family of all life that belongs to that place. And I just was like, wow, that's so meaningful to me. You know, it's the best compliment. And I was like, is that the opposite of pishmupt? Because I know pishuk is bad, rotten, no good, or, you know, it's like, yeah, pishmupt. So literally, pishmupt is not just a bad misbehaving child. It's like a badly living, rooted being. And that's what has happened in so many places around the world. You know, people say now, like, humans suck, and I subscribed to this as well for a while. I joined the voluntary human extinction movement, and humans suck, we're destroying the planet. But I ended up on a panel in Spain and at Wild 10 with 9 other Indigenous men from around the world. There was somebody from the Sahara Desert and all these places. We had 5 minutes to say what wilderness meant to us. And I had gone there ready to say that we have no word for wilderness. Our word is wathiu, closest word means home, and we take care of it. You know, this concept of wilderness, a wild place that humans might visit but don't live in, does not exist. And I just was really stunned. Like every other person on that panel from totally different cultures and environments said the same thing as me. It's our home. We are in reciprocity with it. We take care of it. We listen to it. So that's really, really important. So I'm really grateful to the audience for listening, and the work that is ahead of us is big, and it's important for all future generations. Choo.
Thank you, Gisèle. That was perfect. Yeah, I love that because as a botanist and learning about the plants that are important to Nuu-chah-nulth, and that suffix mupt or bupt in Tla-o-qui-aht, yeah, I always knew that it was plant and more. And the same with the other suffixes in other languages that mean something to do with plant, like hill in Haida, for example. So it's really, your insights are really interesting. And yes, I think you're well rooted as well and connected to the Hachuchli. So, and chuutsqa, would you like to come back and make any observations you wish about the conversation?
I would like to speak about our responsibilities as members of our community. We are unable to, we have to be multi-dimensional. We have to address all our relations, as we say, in our outlook, which means we can't just go and be good at one thing, right? We have to address our relationships in this world, human, animal, land. We really have to take care of all of those. And I put to Gisèle that she's got to come on a community tour for the rest of her life and keep telling those amazing stories, because we need that. Boy, do we need that. And boy, does it help. It always helps, because every time you hear something, it gets you thinking. Maybe a new perspective is gleaned because of what you're thinking and feeling in that day. And of course, I've been really thinking about these two Bear sisters that married two Hesquiaht young boys way back in the beginning, who we actually are descendants of some Bear sisters. So not only are we in reciprocal relationship with them, we are in a family relationship with a lot of the beings and the areas in our place where we belong and where we take care of, right? So we have a lot of relationships to tend to, and of course in this very era that we're in right now, a lot of those relationships are really problematic and really rife with so much grief and loss. So those relationships are really serious, and you really have to take a lot of time out to be able to attend to those relationships. And those take away from what you can do in sort of like a professional sphere, in, outside of your relational responsibilities. So that is a really important thing, that a lot of our responsibilities to our relations are embedded in the learning that we do with our language, and it comes first, our ways of being and being dedicated to carrying that on. So I would really like to point out that there is a real misfit, sometimes it feels like, with choosing a path where you're going to go and share with people in the spirit of reconciliation, to educate them in ways that our public education system did not provide, and fill in that knowledge gap. Or if you're going to put in your energy to go and help feed the people that are putting on the funeral for your uncle. So anyways, back to our two Bear sisters. I just really like it because they married the first two brothers to ever smoke our hissit, our sockeye salmon. They were the ones who discovered how they were going to smoke salmon. So they're heroes, right? Because everybody loves that, right? And they're also part of this huge epic story and place naming where they smoked that salmon, and this epic story of going over the mountains and pretending to be doctors and meeting Dr. Raccoons and all of this amazing stuff that we would like to hear from a storyteller who's really practiced in that art. But at the very end, after skipping a bunch of stuff, what I really love is that these Bear sisters come back to the place where those brothers discovered how to smoke that hissit, and they marry into them, but not before they produce this comb, this carved comb. And they said, okay, well, here's this comb. I want you to take this magical comb and run it through your hair. And so they do it, and their hair gets a little bit longer, a little bit longer. They're like, yeah, keep combing, yeah, a little bit longer, keep on going, a little bit longer. Okay, yeah, now you're handsome, now I'll marry you. And I just love that story because it's so funny. It just really speaks to a funny and comedic relationship that Nuu-chah-nulth people have with each other within their households, between spouses. You know, when people are speaking our language, there's a lot of laughter. And this is really true. I'm not very funny in English. But once you get going with people speaking our language, everybody's a comedian. It's hilarious. It's awesome. And it's a really great spirit and of, you know, good feeling in your Tl'o-qui-aht to be able to connect your language to what's in here and what's connected to where you're from. And so that's that. I wanted to talk about responsibility and how we're a big part of that responsibility for this area. True.
Again, I can just feel the joy that you embody in the work that you're doing. And it's so important, your work, but it's also important and so notable that you are enjoying doing it and that you're being such an amazing teacher for just by what you do. So it was lovely to hear from you. And I love that story. It reminds me of one that Alice Paul told about the Cedar Sisters who turned themselves into yellow cedar trees up in the mountain. But lots of beautiful stories in your part of the world. So Taalgyaa'adad, would you like to add anything else from the conversation that we've had so far?
First of all, Don Guskan dalang ati gudangay laga, dalang hitakan inas ilaw kinakan kan dalang unsida. I said, I am thrilled with the young ladies. They're so young and yet they're so knowledgeable. And they know so much about their language. It's heartwarming to listen to. I'd like to read a poem that Chief Gisèle, he was the chief at the time. He wrote this poem in 1966. So I'd like to read the poem in Haida and then in English. Is that okay? Kait gangang Xaayda Kil Xaayda skulas in gangang Xaayda. Kait gut ilakit in gangang Xaayda. Haidai sungai gut kais konga. Gaganu taju tla-o-qui-aht Tla-o-qui-aht gugam haidai chuutsqa sunga ga. Hait gut tauran gihang genu gut at ging Tla-o-qui-aht sungai gut kais konga. Gongangu guai Xaayda Kil Tla-o-qui-aht kaiskuhan gadu Xaayda gut ilakit gamgina singrichi Tla-o-qui-aht kaska. Tla-o-qui-aht gut kais konga kais gai gagana. Hait gustagang giagang taju Tla-o-qui-aht tlagang haidai Tla-dagang gat Tla-o-qui-aht. Gamnang squansing at good at Kairawai at Ulnagai Wadlochan, Tla-o-qui-aht Kaiskuhan, Singrichi, Gamnang squansing Hanskit Gyagang Tla-o-qui-aht Ganga. People are like trees, and groups of people are like forests. While the forests are composed of many different kinds of trees, These trees intertwine their roots so strongly that it is impossible for the strongest winds which blow on our islands to uproot the forest. For each tree strengthens its neighbor, and their roots are inextricably intertwined. In the same way, the people of our islands, composed of members of nations and races from all over the world, are beginning to intertwine their roots so strongly that no troubles will affect them. Just as one tree standing alone would soon be destroyed by the first strong wind which came along, so is it impossible for any person, any family, or any community to stand alone against the troubles of the world. Written by Chief Louis Collinson. He was Chief Xaayda at the time. Hawa.
Oh, Hawa, Betty. That was such a good choice to read to us. It's a wonderful reminder from a wonderful ancestor, I would say.
Yes. He was our neighbor. He lived right next door to us when I was growing up in Tla-o-qui-aht.
Oh, how I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank each of you again for all your contributions. And now I would like to bring in our other two conveners, Gisèle Martin, Miles Richardson, who you know, Betty, and Dr. David Suzuki. And I also want to just take a moment to express our deep sorrow and sadness at the loss of our other convener, Dr. David Kirshane, who has contributed to this entire series until his passing in December of last year. And we miss him very much, his wisdom and his quiet sense of humor and all of his contributions to this series, as well as his contributions to the world. So I just wanted to mention that. And now I would like to ask Miles to come speak, and then David. Thank you.
I just want to thank the wonderful panel that we just listened to. So much wisdom and such a, I mean, what it just leaves me is feeling hopeful. You know, language is one of the key aspects of who we are, and so important for us to maintain going forward. And you know, I'm really thankful to share this webinar with Dr. Taalgyaa'adad, my mom. Yeah, it's been a really special morning. But when I think of that hopefulness, I also think of things that Gisèle and chuutsqa talked about in terms of their nation and their experience, and Wade in observing our peoples and cultures.
Excuse me, Miles, could you turn your video on?
I'm trying to, and it says it can't.
Oh, there you are.
Okay.
Good to see you.
I've been trying to do it while I'm talking on the side there to turn it on, but there we are. Yeah, it's so much wisdom being shared and pulling this dialogue together. And thank you, Nancy, for remembering Dr. Dave Kirshane, who reminded us always when undertaking important things like this discussion we're having this morning, to do it in proper ceremony and start with the proper expressions of gratitude, which our people always do, and that's so important. But when I look at what's going on now and the state of understanding we're gleaning for the path forward, I know that humankind needs what we're talking about today. And our ceremony will teach us, will remind us that we're all in this together. I'm thinking back when I was a young man getting into politics about the mid-'80s, and it was a pretty daunting situation. They're threatening to cut the last tree on Haida Gwaii, take the last minerals, do away with all the fish. And now that Canada was considering drilling for oil and gas in our oceans, it was unthinkable to our people that we could survive after all this happened. In fact, that's what our elders said to us. Look, this isn't about economics. This isn't about money. It's not being paid for what was taken. They don't have enough money to pay us for what they've taken. What this is about handing on our legacy as the living generation of an ancient and proud nation. And if we're going to do that, they told us young leaders, we must protect our life source. We must protect Haida Gwaii. That's why we're here, not because of Canada and BC or any other force. We're here because of the richness of our homelands. And then we built a constitution. We acted to protect our homelands in a relationship between humans and the rest of creation that reflected the values we inherited as a people. Through our culture, we invoked our culture. And then I got in, as president of the Haida Nation, me and Tla-o-qui-aht, Diane Brown, got invited to the Fourth World Wilderness Congress by the Circle of Traditional Elders, North American spiritual leaders from all over Turtle Island, all over the continent. They wanted to hear our story. They saw it on the TV and stuff, and they wanted to hear it straight from us. So I'll never forget this one morning. We're sitting in this hall, 55 countries there, and I'm telling sad stories about the state of our people. We're losing our language, we're losing our culture, we're losing our ceremonies, and all these things that were going on. I was lamenting about these, and there was about 20 elders sitting around the table, and one of them sitting next to me I thought was sleeping. And in the middle of my tirade, he looks up, and I don't know what his exact words were, but it sounded to me something like, "Hey, young fella, you know all those things you're talking about losing? Your culture, your ceremonies, your language." He said, "They haven't gone anywhere. They're in exactly the same place your forefathers found them." He said, "They're in the forests, they're in the trees, they're in the undersea world, they're in the swimmers, they're in the sky world, they're in the winged ones." He said, "They're in the forelegs." He said, "You've just forgot how to listen." He said, "I have one piece of advice for you. Before you take another step forward, take a step back and remember how to listen." That's one of the most profound lessons I've heard, and I hear it, that same message in the speakers today, in relating from the lessons that they've gleaned through their cultures and what it's going to take for us as humankind, all in this together to thrive, not just survive, not just be sustainable, as Gisèle says, but to thrive. And yeah, I'm thankful for today. How to each and every one of you.
Housekeeping.
Betty,
was-
has he been listening since then? Just wondering.
I think so.
Except when I'm trying to tell her how to properly pronounce a Haida word, nothing drives her up the wall like that.
Oh, you were talking to me. I'm sorry.
We're wondering if he really was listening to you.
You all know the answer to that.
You don't need to answer. And now it's my great pleasure to recognize Dr. David Suzuki as the original, Miles and David together, the two original people who were inspired to put this whole thing together. And it's really wonderful to have you with us as always, David.
Well, it's great to be here and to see this. You know, we're coming to the towards the end of the series, but this is just a marvelous, marvelous way to approach the end. I thank everybody for taking part in it. And you know, the first time I heard the concept of the ethnosphere from Wade, I was absolutely electrified because it just added so much more to the way I was thinking of the big picture than just the biosphere. But we can, because really it is the ethnosphere that is what defines our place on this planet. And it's, you know, I'm in Wee-Wai-Kai area right now on Quadra Island. My roots, such as they are, came from Japan 3 generations ago. But my grandparents, both sides of my family, my paternal and maternal grandparents, never learned to speak English. My parents, of course, were fluently bilingual, but they spoke English at home. I never learned to speak Japanese, and so I never had a conversation with my grandparents. I had no roots really in the old country. My parents had never been to Japan. And so there were no roots, and they're very, very shallow. So the roots that have been developed for me are in the colonial roots, which came over here, well, it came into BC, what, a couple hundred years ago, which are really fundamentally resourcist. It's a resourcist mentality that has come here. And that's what we hear over and over again. The difference between the indigenous languages your languages are built on place, on an understanding of place and how our survival and well-being is utterly dependent on the relationship with not just the animals and plants, but the air, the water, and the sunlight that makes you who we are. And the crisis we face today is this whole resources attitude that only sees land and water and air in one way, through the idea of what good is it for me. And I thought that the truckers protest in Ottawa was the epitome of what happens then when you get this attitude that it's all about me. Those truckers are talking about freedom with no sense of responsibility is not freedom. That's anarchy. It's craziness that we are told over and over again from Indigenous people about reciprocity and responsibility that comes with receiving from the world around us. I just want to say I was just beginning my graduate work at the University of Chicago in 1958 when 2 colleagues, Dick Lewontin and Jack Hubby, were starting to look at individual genes in fruit flies. I was a fruit fly geneticist, and they were looking at, they could look at individual flies and say, well, here's a gene for an esterase, a specific product in this species. If we look from individual to individual within the same species, we expect to find it very homogeneous. That is, they should all carry the same form of that esterase gene. And the shocking thing was, they don't. There's a tremendous amount of diversity, what we now call genetic polymorphism. And we now know that the definition of a healthy species is by the degree of genetic polymorphism we have. That's why inbreeding, or a small population in which there's not much genetic diversity, is considered a very vulnerable population, vulnerable to new forces of diseases or environmental changes and so on. Genetic polymorphism is built into our species as one of the aspects of our survival over time. But within ecosystems, we find a tremendous diversity of species. When you go to ecosystems that are not diverse, like desert ecosystems, you find that the lack of species diversity makes that a very vulnerable kind of ecosystem. And around the world, what you find is what has enabled life to flourish is diverse ecosystems, whether it's desert, whether it's Arctic, whether it's rainforests or mountains or wetlands. So what we find is that life strategy over time for survival has been like Russian dolls of diversity. You get genetic diversity over which you have species diversity and ecosystem diversity. And in the ethnosphere, it's the cultural diversity that has enabled us to flourish within that great aspect of diversity. Monoculture, we've learned, when you try to monoculture, as we do in agriculture, for example, that becomes unbelievably vulnerable. So we've seen in the United States that when you have one variety of corn or wheat, and then you get the outbreak of a new parasite or new disease, that you can demolish literally hundreds of thousands of acres of your monoculture. And yet we are going against the biological strategy of life, which is diversity, by attempting to monoculture the planet with a single notion of, well, a single language that Wade has talked about so terrifyingly. We are monoculturing the planet with a very limited number of languages, and thereby reduce our knowledge base and our ability to live on a diverse planet. So it all kind of comes together, and I just want to thank you all for participating in this really important meeting today, but also thank you all individually for working on perpetuating your languages, because it's a critical part of our survival into the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was a perfect way to summarize all of this. And I want to also, just at this time, acknowledge the people who are working hard behind the scenes to make all of this happen. We have Jackie Miller, who is you've been talking to, but Eden Toth is behind looking at your questions, and Darren Ma is there, just making sure everything is running smoothly and picking up any glitches. So thank you to you three behind the scenes. We couldn't do this without each of you. We have a few minutes now for questions from the audience, and Eden has been sending me a few, some to individuals among you and some to each of the panelists. And I know that Wade, you need to leave promptly, and there's one question here for you. I'm going to give that as the first one from one of the audience members, and then we'll just carry on. And at about 10:02, we will ask Betty to give us the ceremonial closing, and then Jackie will have just a few housekeeping notes at the very end, and we will finish at noon. So this is a question from one of our audience. Wade, can you tell us about the relationship between the ethnosphere and biosphere? Well, I think that's been covered, but you might want to add some more to that, Wade.
Well, I think it's something that it's always interesting to sort of look at the historical background. There was an amazing moment when I was in graduate school in 1979 when the Dalai Lama wrapped up his first ever tour of North America. And he spoke at Harvard in a big theater called the Sanders Theater. And that very night, across the way, the late Ed Wilson was introducing a man called Norman Myers, who had just written a book called The Sinking Ark, which was one of the first books to really address the looming biodiversity crisis. And naturally, all the kids and faculty were across the way to listen to the 14th Dalai Lama. And literally, in introducing Dr. Myers, Ed Wilson apologized to him for the sparse audience in that hall. And he said, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, you know how far we've got to go to educate the public at large." Now, Ed Wilson, as David knows well, was as kind and decent a man as ever existed, as a generous, a brilliant scientist, many say the Darwin of the 20th century, and he would have regretted those words to his death. But it wasn't really his fault. It was sort of an indication of the chasm that existed then between the natural sciences and the social sciences. In other words, anthropologists saw the naturalists as being misanthropic and elitist. The naturalists saw people as the problem, Indigenous people in particular. And I think that night I may have been the only student running back and forth between the two lectures, because it was so obvious to me that the same forces that were eroding cultural diversity were eroding biological diversity. We had to sort of put those two things together. And I think we obviously have, and I think that's part of what this dialogue today has been all about. So that's really, the bottom line, as David said, there is a fire burning over the world, taking it with it plants and animals, languages, visionary wisdom, and ancient intuitions, and quelling the flames of that fire and reinventing and re-embracing the poetry of diversity, I think, is one of the most important challenges of our time.
Thanks, Wade. And I think you've spent a good part of your career in your life just making those connections, which we really thank you for. Here's a question for each of you. Feel free to jump in if you want to have something to say about this. Question for all: what are ways to bring the lessons being taught today into our public education system? Do you want to just start, Wade, since you're here with us already, and then we'll just ask each Gisèle and chuutsqa.
Well, I'll just very briefly say that, polemics are not persuasive and politicians follow, they rarely lead, but I really do believe that storytellers can change the world. And that's certainly what I've tried to do. Getting Gisèle before the public, and Housekeeping in front of people, sharing this kind of moving narrative, I think is absolutely essential. I really do believe that stories change history.
Thanks, Wade.
Nancy,
Gisèle?
Nancy, let me just say that one of our intentions, David and I and yours, of course, and Dave Cruchain's intentions was this dialogue this webinar series would establish a dialogue on all of these important topics. From this dialogue, we hope will arise relationships and following through on with specific actions. Some of those may be educational, even in the school system. So let's keep track of these and look at the relationships that we can build from this dialogue and keep following through where there's a will. But also, Jackie will talk more about this later, but each of these webinars is being edited into a piece of a book. So we're going to publish each of these webinars as part of a book that's just capturing the summary of the dialogue at each of those. So those are tools for people wanting to use it for challenges like the question there. Thank you.
Thanks, Miles. Good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I hope that although we're finishing these series, that the work that we're doing will continue on with all of us. Gisèle?
I think since learning language and being guided on how to speak about these things, it would be really easy to get caught up in more than full-time work of outward facing, what some people call like decolonizing work, you know, and bringing culture to all the institutions that exist in the colonial structure. But I really feel that the best place would be to actually support the continued existence of the nations internally, of the places internally, the protection of those places. So, you know, I see, yeah, I mean, we could put funding into bringing it to schools, and that's great, and that does need to happen as well. But more importantly, like, what are nations in their own territories initiating and working on that need to be supported, and how can we support those things? There's like Hawaiian language school on the Big Island of Hawaii. And one thing I got from them at a language conference was, don't try to live up to the institutional standards, like always uphold your cultural standards first. And I think it's really important that we keep that there, you know, so that we don't end up just slotting our culture into boxes that can be ticked off. We need to actually practice it in reality. So one for me is, instead of working on doing public presentations and things over Indigenous Week, you know, around June 21st, I'm gonna just go out and be Indigenous and be on the land and get away from Zoom. And I think it's really important that when we are, that people are supported in their work to do that and recognized.
Thank you. That's a perfect answer. And I'm reminded of an elder of the Xaayda Nation who always said, you can't just talk about it, you have to do it. And that goes with the bringing children out into the land to create those relationships. You can't just talk about it or read about it, you have to do it. Chuutsqa.
Hey.
Oh,
So, go ahead.
and David after. Yeah, go ahead, chuutsqa.
Okay, so my speaking of responsibility, my parents and my uncle Bernard had a really undue, lengthy responsibility over me when I decided to go home and learn my language, because they had to keep me alive. And it was just through their generosity and connection that we we had lots of food to eat, and we were, although we were destitute for cash for the first several years, trying to pursue this dream that we didn't know if we could become speakers of the language, that we had help. It would be really good if you're somebody who is searching for somebody to fund, to really do your research in your local area and find out who's directly doing that work with their own people to bring their language back, because we are the ones who continue on this really lengthy work, and we'll pass it on to the people who are always going to stay and be there to do that work and carry that forward. And of 36 languages in the province of BC and over 60 across Canada, we are vastly underfunded, especially as compared to the French and English language curriculums. If we could just have a little bit of parity there, even something a little bit closer than the little speck of dust that we're getting funded to only on reserve schools, so that we're trying to keep students learning on reserve their own language, even though there has been a plan that has scattered us off of reserve all over the place. We really need a better funding model to get all of those languages moving, and to get people into actually doing their language as a profession. That would be pretty awesome.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll take that to heart, I think. David, please.
Yeah, I don't know how relevant this is to the question, but I was interviewing a few weeks ago a man named David Keith, who's a Harvard professor, formerly from the University of Calgary, who is pushing hard for geoengineering. He's saying we've screwed up the climate so badly, we've got to take over the atmosphere and cut down on how much radiation comes from the sun and reaches the earth. And anyway, that's an aside. During our pre-interview, he was saying, well, I've been an environmentalist all my life. I worked with my father in getting the conserving the peregrine falcon. And this is kind of the attitude, you know, that we've trashed the habitat of the peregrine falcon. And so we managed to give them a little support in a city, and wow, they're able to make their nests on a ledge in a tall building, and they feed on the pigeons that are attracted to the city. And so look at that, we've conserved it, you know. And to me, that's not conservation. We're just celebrating that the peregrine has been able to adapt to a completely alien habitat. Where you know, we've got Indigenous cultures now embedded in this dominant culture on whom we're all now dependent for the basic things to survive. But that culture is only alive so long as the habitat within which it occurred flourished. So I would say, give it back. The land back movement is something we've got to support. We've got all this land that we call crown land. That's not crown land, that's Indigenous land. Give it back. And if there is land that's occupied, and as James Gosnell said years ago to Trudeau, he said, we own this land lock, stock, and barrel. Although I think the idea of ownership of land is a kind of alien concept. We have to say that in English, but give it back. And if there's too much occupation or development, is like where I live in Vancouver, pay rent. Those people for whom we all now acknowledge at any public meeting, we acknowledge whose territory it is. For God's sakes, pay the rent, and then allow their culture to grow back again in some way. But I think the land back movement is a very, very important movement for culture to flourish.
Thank you, David. I agree. That's all I'll say. I totally agree. Dr. Taalgyaa'adad, would you like to add anything into that question?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
The question was, what are ways to bring the lessons being taught today into our public education system?
Oh, I worry about the last of our fluent speakers who are passing. It almost makes me feel panicky when I think about it. And I think that we should get everything that we can out of the remaining fluent speakers, so that our language can be spoken properly. And we are very fortunate to have young people who are learning the language and learning to speak it properly. And we are teaching even our babies on Haida to speak. And I am very excited about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that in other communities as well, the language programs are going full out, and
Right.
young people are learning from elders and speakers and all these different languages. And it's really heartwarming to see that. We've run out of time and we have some more questions, but I'm just going to read some of them, and we won't be able to answer them now, but we'll keep these questions in mind for all of you who took the trouble to ask. And
Nancy, it's Miles. Can I just add a suggestion? Maybe our
sure.
Our staff, our good staff here can, if anyone wants to list your language program or some language initiative that you think is worthy of support. I see several people on the chat looking for how they can help and support these initiatives. Maybe if any of you would like, we can just list it on our website and put a contact there. And it's one way of starting to build relationships. Hawa.
Thanks, Miles. I think that's a great idea. So I'll just go over the other questions. One was for Gisèle and maybe Miles about language revitalization programs, and how they're gaining strength as our Indigenous Guardians programs. Is there any connection between your language work and some of the guardianship work that's happening out on the lands and waters? And I think this is a big question, and I know you've got lots to say about it, but we won't be able to look at that directly. But this will be, some of these questions will be answered in the book and through other means. There's another one for chuutsqa. One of our attendees who is Anishinaabe has asked how they can carry Mino Bimadisiwan, excuse my pronunciation, teachings, how to live in a good way with as they help to change the systems beyond the structures of modernity and colonialism. And so that's one to think about as well. And there's one more from a Western scientist in the audience. DNA is a beautiful language that connects all life, but is generally observed in laboratories, a place where there are few Indigenous voices. How do we connect the forest with the lab? That's another big question. And so, dear friends, I think that's all that we have time for, and it's been a pleasure to be a part of this discussion, and would like to ask our dear elder to provide us with a closing.
If you will all bow your heads in prayer. Sotlana kunang idul khaidagas dang kirai skana gwaga hayat gina at alankith gulas reiskis at it gudingai la kotstuga salana agan sakyangai lago Sotlana dau gina wadluchan gan unsida dau gina wadluchan gan kulaga Hawa. Amen.
Hawa Betty, Hawa to all of you. I will now just turn it over to Jackie for some final housekeeping notes, and that will complete our session.
Great job, Nancy.
Thank you, Miles. It's been a pleasure, really.
Thanks, Nancy. Housekeeping, Hawa, Tla-o-qui-aht, and thank you to Nancy, Taalgyaa'adad, Betty, chuutsqa, Gisèle, Wade, Miles, and David, and to all of our attendees for taking the time for this conversation today. We'll be sending out a short survey soon. I believe Eden's going to post it in the chat right now. And we'd appreciate it if you take a few minutes to share your thoughts on today's session with us. We always read them and enjoy your feedback, and pass that on to the speakers and our conveners as well. And as Nancy and Miles have mentioned, we're in the process now of winding down our online dialogue series, and we'll be focusing next on honoring our convener, the late Elder Dr. Dave Kershane, as both Miles and Nancy have mentioned. And we'll keep you apprised as our plans develop. The other thing to mention is the book that Miles has mentioned. So we've been in talks with Greystone Books for the last year and a bit, talking about an idea for the book. They've been very interested in this dialogue series and the wonderful conversations that we've been having over the course of the series, such as the beautiful one we had today. And so we'll be working closely with Greystone Books, and basically Miles, Nancy, and I will be working on that together. And so stay tuned for more news about that, but we're working to roll up all of these beautiful discussions and ideas into a book for a lasting legacy. In addition, We have the recordings for these dialogues on our website as a resource for people to turn to as they're interested, and share it on our social media as well. And so if you're not already on our mailing list, you can sign up at waysofknowingforum.ca to receive the recording from today, as well as updates on our future plans. And thank you very much for joining us today, as well as through the entirety of this series. And we'll keep you posted on our next plans. Hawa.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks all of you.